Well, my first guest tonight is Michael Kimmage. He's a history professor at Catholic University of America and a former State Department Russia-Ukraine expert under former President Barack Obama. Professor, it's good to have you on the program. Let me just ask you about today's announcement. 3,000 additional U.S. troops being sent to Eastern Europe. Is that just a drop in the bucket?
Well, it's certainly not a hugely significant military factor. The key point, of course, is that these are U.S. troops that are not being sent to Ukraine. U.S. has committed not to fight directly in Ukraine. They're being sent to NATO allies. They're a sign of support, and I think they're supposed to provide reassurance, but they're not anything that truly changes the military dynamic of the situation on the ground.
And they're not going to fight in Ukraine. They're not going to be sent to Ukraine, but today's announcement is really all about Ukraine, isn't it? I mean, there is this fear. And we just heard from a member of the Polish parliament this evening that if there were to be an invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that conflict would then spill over into one of the NATO neighbors. How concerned are you that that could actually happen?
Well, that's certainly a very significant concern. If you think of the size of Ukraine as a country, you think of its position, you also think of how Russian military hardware and troops have been moved into Belarus. You can see that the regional security dynamic is changing in Europe. And, I think it's imperative that Washington reassure its allies. But I think that the troops are being sent precisely so the conflict doesn't spill over beyond the borders of Ukraine. I think that's the hope behind the sending of the troops, not an expectation that it will spill over.
We have seen reports of what the U.S. is offering Russia. For example, it's what's being called a transparency mechanism to confirm that there are no cruise missiles in Romania and Poland. Do you think that that is something the Russians will see as progress here?
I think it's potentially possible. The NATO document that was leaked to a European newspaper sort of came out this morning is detailed. It's constructive. It doesn't give the Russians by any means what they're asking for in terms of the three demands or ultimatums that were put forward a couple of weeks ago by Moscow, but it's certainly a beginning of a conversation and one that's sort of practical-minded and could lead in interesting diplomatic directions if the Russians are willing to follow through on that.
Well, the U.S. has made demands of Russia and vice versa. Apart from the concrete threat of sanctions, we're not seeing a lot in the way of red lines here. Does that leave the U.S. and Russia with wiggle room, with the flexibility to negotiate away from this confrontation?
Absolutely. Of course, a lot depends on what Putin's intentions are. If he's decided to go to war already, then the diplomacy is merely theater. Of course, we don't know that. And if Putin is signaling that he wants to have a new and different conversation about European security, the Biden administration is not going to make dramatic concessions, and they're not going to, sort of do anything substantive probably in the short to medium term. But I think that they're willing to be interlocutors. And of course, you have European countries, France and others that are engaging in diplomacy with Russia as well. So, nobody is closing the door, which I think is a very good thing.
We've been hearing, especially in the past couple of weeks, that one reason perhaps why Vladimir Putin seems to be so stubborn this time is because he has China to rely on. I mean, the Kremlin is claiming today that China backs Russian calls for security guarantees from the West. I mean, how likely is it that China will give any real backing for Russia when it comes to this Ukraine standoff?
Oh, I think that's probably bluster. I don't think China would be involved, and it's not clear that China, in any sense, wants a conflict with Ukraine, which is an important economic partner of China's. Where China is important for Russia is that it could help with sanctions if those were to come in greater volume from the West. And what China will do in the event of a conflict with Ukraine is not bother Russia on its eastern border, so that, in a sense, frees Russia up to move its military assets westward. But China is not going to partner with Russia militarily in anything on Ukraine. I think that's absolutely clear, whatever the rhetoric may suggest.
We've heard also that Russia's military is much better equipped now than it was in 2014, modernized, able to, walk the walk and talk the talk. We've also heard that the Kremlin has amassed a huge surplus of foreign currency reserves, especially dollars, but also euros. With both of those factors, if they are true, would they help to explain why Russia may be blustering so much, or why Russia may think that it's worth, taking the chance here and invading Ukraine?
Well, that's correct. I mean, I think if Russia does make that move, it's going to be because it has political ends in mind. So it's not just, flexing its military muscle, but certainly if you look at the time between 2014 and the present, the key event for Russia is its military move into Syria, which I think Russia judges a success. So yes, they've been pouring a lot of money into the military. And I think they feel, in a general sense, that this gives them a voice in Europe. And they're very clear about trying to use that voice. If it truly does, and what the response of Europe is something that remains to be seen. But no doubt Russia is looking at its military assets and feels a degree of confidence in them, and that's playing a role in Russian diplomacy at the present moment.
Professor Michael Kimmage, as always, Professor, we appreciate your time and your insights. Good to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.